Hold up. I'm hearing some crime sound going on bigger analysis. You know what? We screw cause you gotta see what's going on in LA right now.
In the Pacific Northwest of the United States lies a region famous for its beauty. Endless evergreen forests stretch across the landscape. Fog rolls gently over winding rivers in the early mornings. Small towns sit quietly between mountains and valleys, and in the early 1980s, life in these communities moved slowly. Families gathered for weekend barbecues. Children rode their bikes down quiet suburban streets. Neighbors knew each other by name. Seattle and the surrounding towns felt peaceful, safe, predictable. But sometimes, the most terrifying stories don't begin with chaos. They begin in places that feel completely normal. Because while life continued peacefully for thousands of people across Washington state, someone else was living among them. A man who blended perfectly into society. A man who looked like an ordinary worker. A neighbor, a co-worker, someone who waved politely and went to church on Sundays. But behind that ordinary life, he was hiding a secret darker than anyone could imagine. Because somewhere in those quiet forests and empty roads, a predator had already begun hunting, and no one knew he existed. At first, nothing seemed unusual. A missing person report here, another one there. Young women disappearing from the streets. Some were last seen standing along busy highways late at night. Others were hitchhiking between cities. Some were sex workers trying to earn enough money to survive another day. For many of them, life had already been difficult. They lived on the margins of society, and sadly, when women like this disappeared during that time, their cases did not always receive immediate attention. Sometimes police assumed they had simply left town. Sometimes investigators believed they had chosen to disappear. But families knew better. Mothers knew when something wasn't right. Friends knew when someone would never simply vanish without a word. And slowly, a disturbing pattern began to form. Because these women weren't leaving, they were disappearing, and someone was responsible. August 1982. Near the quiet banks of the Green River just south of Seattle. The river wound slowly through the valley, surrounded by dense trees and tall grass. To most people, it was just another peaceful place in Washington state, a place where children explored during the summer, where fishermen cast their lines into the water. But on one particular afternoon, a young boy walking along the riverbank noticed something strange floating near the shoreline. At first, it looked like a large piece of debris drifting in the current. Maybe a log, maybe garbage caught along the edge of the water. But the longer he looked, the more something felt wrong. The shape didn't move like driftwood. The color didn't look natural. And as the boy slowly moved closer, the horrifying truth became clear. It wasn't debris. It was the body of a young woman. What that boy had discovered would soon shock an entire state. Police quickly arrived at the scene. Investigators carefully removed the body from the water. The victim was young. She had been reported missing months earlier. At first, detectives treated the discovery as a tragic but isolated homicide. But then something even more disturbing happened. Another body was discovered nearby, then another, and then another. Within a matter of days, investigators realized they were not dealing with a single crime. They were facing something far more terrifying. Multiple women had been murdered, and their bodies had been dumped along the same river. The victims were identified as Wendy Lee Cofield, Deborah Bonner, Marcia Chapman. Each woman had disappeared earlier that year. Each one had been strangled, and each had been abandoned near the Green River. The realization sent a chill through investigators because it meant one thing: a serial killer was operating in Washington state. As investigators studied the victims, a disturbing connection began to appear. Many of the women had last been seen along Pacific Highway South. This long road stretched through the southern suburbs of Seattle. By the early 1980s, parts of this highway had become known for prostitution and street crime. At night, the road looked very different. Streetlights illuminated empty parking lots. Cars moved slowly down the highway, and young women stood along the roadside waiting for customers. Many of them were incredibly vulnerable. Some were teenagers who had run away from home. Others struggled with addiction. Many had nowhere else to go, and unfortunately, someone had begun using that vulnerability to his advantage. Because among the drivers passing through that highway, one man wasn't looking for a transaction. He was looking for victims.
The killer understood something most people didn't want to admit, something uncomfortable, something society often looked away from. Not every disappearance is treated the same. Not every life is given the same urgency. If a college student vanished from a quiet campus, there would be search parties by morning, news vans parked outside dormitories, headlines spreading across the country within hours. If a suburban mother disappeared, entire communities would mobilize. Neighbors would organize searches. Police departments would dedicate every available resource. But along Pacific Highway South, things were different. The women who stood under those dim streetlights at night often lived lives that went unnoticed. Some were runaways, teenagers who had left broken homes. Others were struggling with addiction. Some had lost contact with their families years earlier. Many were simply trying to survive one more day, one more night. And because of that, when they disappeared, it didn't always trigger immediate panic. Sometimes friends assumed they had moved on. Sometimes no one reported them missing right away. Days would pass, then weeks, and in that time, the killer had already chosen his next victim. That silence, that delay, that lack of urgency, it gave him something incredibly dangerous. Time. Time to move freely. Time to erase his tracks. Time to continue. And over time, that understanding turned into confidence. Because as the bodies began to appear, and as the disappearances continued, the killer realized something chilling. No one was close to catching him. And in his mind, no one ever would. By the end of 1982, the situation had become impossible to ignore. What had once seemed like isolated cases was now clearly something far more serious. Bodies had been found, patterns had emerged, and the fear was spreading. Law enforcement agencies across Washington state began coordinating their efforts. The King County Sheriff's Office took the lead, and what followed was one of the largest criminal investigations the state had ever seen. A massive task force was assembled. Hundreds of detectives were assigned to the case. Specialists from different departments joined forces, and eventually, even the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped in to assist. Inside the task force headquarters, the scale of the investigation was overwhelming. Entire walls were covered with maps. Every known disappearance marked with colored pins: red, blue, yellow. Each one representing a life, a story, a person who had vanished. Photographs of victims lined the walls, case files stacked high on desks. Detectives moved between tables, comparing timelines, cross-referencing locations, searching for patterns that might reveal the killer's identity. Phones rang constantly. Tips came in from across the state, and every lead, no matter how small, was taken seriously. Investigators worked long hours. Late nights turned into early mornings. Coffee cups piled up. Sleep became secondary. Because somewhere out there, a killer was still active, and every day that passed was another opportunity for him to strike again. But no matter how hard they worked, no matter how many leads they followed, the one thing they couldn't find was him. As the investigation expanded, so did the number of possibilities. Tips flooded in from everywhere: concerned citizens, witnesses, anonymous callers, people who believed they had seen something suspicious, or someone suspicious.
More than 15,000 tips were recorded. Thousands of individuals were interviewed. Men from all walks of life were brought in for questioning. Some were cooperative, others nervous. Some had solid alibis, others had none. There were moments when investigators believed they were close, a suspect who seemed to fit the profile, a timeline that almost made sense. But every time, something didn't add up. The evidence fell apart, and the case slipped through their fingers once again. In some cases, men even confessed to crimes they didn't commit, desperate for attention or struggling with their own issues. False confessions only complicated the investigation further. Lie detector tests were administered. Surveillance operations were conducted. Undercover officers were deployed along Pacific Highway South, trying to lure the killer into making a mistake. But he never did. He remained patient, careful, disciplined. And while investigators chased thousands of leads, the killer continued his routine. Unseen, unnoticed, untouched.
Among the many individuals interviewed during the investigation was a man named Gary Ridgway. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about him. He wasn't charismatic. He didn't stand out. He wasn't someone who drew attention when he entered a room. He worked a regular job as a truck painter at the Kenworth Truck Company. A steady, routine job. The kind of job thousands of people worked every day. He lived in Auburn, a quiet suburban area. The kind of neighborhood where people greeted each other in passing, where nothing ever seemed out of place. To his co-workers, Ridgway was just another employee, quiet, reserved, sometimes socially awkward, but not threatening. To his neighbors, he was simply the man next door. He attended church, followed routines, lived an ordinary life. And that's what made him so dangerous. Because no one expects evil to look ordinary. But there were small details that didn't quite fit. Witnesses had reported seeing Ridgway along Pacific Highway South. Several claimed he had picked up women from the roadside. At the time, it didn't seem like enough, but it was enough to put his name on the radar. And for a brief moment, investigators came closer to the truth than they realized. In 1983, detectives brought Ridgway in for questioning. They sat across from him in a small interview room, fluorescent lights overhead, case files spread across the table. They asked him about the women, about the disappearances, about his movements during certain nights. Ridgway answered calmly, directly. He denied everything. There was no panic in his voice, no visible fear, just a quiet, steady confidence. To investigators, he didn't behave like someone hiding a dark secret. He behaved like someone who believed he was in control. To push further, they administered a polygraph test, a lie detector, a tool designed to measure stress responses, to detect deception. The room was silent as the test was conducted. Every question carefully asked, every response carefully monitored. And when the results came in, they were unexpected. Ridgway passed. There were no clear signs of deception, no indication that he was lying. Without physical evidence, without a failed test, investigators had no legal grounds to hold him. So they made a decision. They let him go. And as Ridgway walked out of that station, no one realized what had just happened. Because in that moment, one of the most dangerous killers in American history had just slipped through their hands. The years that followed were filled with uncertainty and fear. Throughout the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, the disappearances didn't stop. Women continued to vanish, from bus stops, from parking lots, from streets they had walked countless times before. Some were last seen getting into cars, others simply disappeared into the night. And then, weeks later, months later, remains would be discovered, hidden in forests, scattered across remote areas, left in places where nature itself seemed to conceal the truth.
The killer had learned the terrain. He understood where to go, where not to go, which areas were rarely visited, which locations would delay discovery. He used the environment as part of his method, and over time, that method became more refined, more controlled, more deliberate. For investigators, the case began to feel endless. Every new discovery raised more questions. Every answer led to more uncertainty. And as years passed, the fear never truly disappeared, because no one knew when it would happen again. For a long time, it seemed like the case might never be solved. Too many victims, too many years, too many dead ends. But by the late 1990s, something changed. Technology had advanced. Forensic science had entered a new era. DNA analysis had become more precise, more reliable, more powerful than ever before. Evidence that had once been considered useless now had the potential to reveal the truth. Investigators reopened the case. Old evidence was brought out of storage, carefully preserved for years. Clothing, hair, biological samples. Each piece re-examined with modern techniques. And slowly, piece by piece, a connection began to form. A pattern within the evidence itself. Until finally, there was a match.
In 2001, nearly 2 decades after the first bodies were discovered, everything changed. Police moved in, and Gary Ridgway was arrested. The DNA evidence was undeniable. It connected him directly to multiple victims. Years of investigation, thousands of leads, all leading back to the same man, the quiet worker, the neighbor, the man no one truly suspected. For investigators, it was a moment of relief, but also a moment of realization, because the question was no longer who. The question now was, how many? During interrogation, Ridgway began to talk, at first carefully, measured, but as time passed, the details became clearer and more disturbing. He described how he approached women, how he gained their trust, how he used simple conversations to lower their guard. Investigators listened closely. Some took notes, others simply sat in silence, trying to process what they were hearing. Because what Ridgway revealed was not just a series of crimes, it was a pattern, a system, something he had repeated again and again over the years. Eventually, he confessed to 49 murders, 49 lives, 49 stories. But even then, there was uncertainty, because investigators believed the number could be higher, and some victims may never be identified. In 2003, Gary Ridgway pleaded guilty to dozens of murders. He was sentenced to multiple life terms in prison, and today, he remains behind bars. But the story doesn't end there, because the impact of his crimes still lingers. Families continue to search for answers. Some still wait for closure, and the forests of Washington remain as quiet as they were decades ago. The Green River still flows, calm, unchanged. But beneath that calm surface lies a history that can never be erased, a reminder of what happened, and a question that may never be fully answered. Did he tell the whole truth? Or are there still stories, hidden somewhere in the shadows, waiting to be discovered?